Annie Hadley read the last letter by the dim light of a candle that had burned so low the wax pooled against her fingertips, and she set it down on the table with the same quiet disappointment she had felt after reading all the others. 30 letters. 30 men who had found her name through the matrimonial columns of the Kansas City Gazette, where the small notice had run for 8 weeks at the end of 1882, placed there by her aunt with Annie's reluctant permission. The notice said only that a woman of 24 years, educated, capable, and of sound character, sought correspondence with an honest man settled in the Western Territories, with the view of matrimony if both parties found themselves agreeable. It said nothing about her brown hair or the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, nothing about the small farm outside of St. Louis that had been her father's, and was now just a burden of debt she could not carry alone, nothing about the loneliness that had settled into her bones like a Missouri winter, persistent and cold and total. The 30 letters came from miners and ranchers and a self-described gentleman of Tucson who mentioned his income in the first sentence and again in the last. They came from a man in Abilene who promised her a house with glass windows, and a man in Dodge City who promised her a cook stove and a piano that he would have shipped from Chicago. They promised comfort and security and affection, and good weather and land and livestock. They promised her things the way men promise things they were not entirely certain they possessed, with the particular boldness of someone speaking into a void. She answered them all because her aunt had raised her to be courteous, and because she genuinely wanted to believe that one of them would say something that sounded like a real person rather than an advertisement. She thanked each man for writing and declined each offer with the careful language of someone who had read enough to know how to say no without cruelty. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November of 1882, when the first real snow was beginning to collect on the fence posts outside, she opened the 31st letter. It was written on plain paper, not the heavy cream stock that several of the others had used to suggest prosperity. The handwriting was deliberate but not fancy, the kind of penmanship that came from a man who had learned it practically rather than ornamentally. It read as follows: Miss Hadley, my name is Jedediah Brenner. I am 30 years old and I run a cattle ranch outside of a small town called Harland in the New Mexico Territory. The ranch is called the Box Elder, named for the creek that runs along its southern edge. I have been on this land for 6 years. Before that I was a drover on the Kishom Trail, and before that I was from Ohio, which I think is enough said about Ohio. I am writing because a friend of mine showed me the notice in the Gazette and said I ought to. I am not going to promise you anything. I do not think promises made to a stranger across a distance of 1,000 miles are worth the ink they are written in, and I suspect you have already received more of them than you care to count. What I can tell you is what is true. The ranch is a working one. The house has 3 rooms and a good roof. The country here is nothing like Missouri. The winters are milder, but the summers are hard, and the land does not forgive carelessness. I am not an easy man to know, or so I have been told, but I have been told worse things that turned out to be less true than that one. If you care to write back, I would be glad to hear from you. If you do not, I understand that too. Jedediah Brenner. Annie read it twice. Then she read it a third time more slowly, the way you read something you want to be sure you are understanding correctly. She set it down and looked at the snow collecting on the fence posts and thought about a man who would not promise her anything, who thought the promises meant less than the truth, who understood that she might not write back. She picked up her pen before the candle went out entirely. She wrote back that same night. She told him her name was Annie Hadley, which he already knew, and then she laughed at herself for beginning that way and started again. She told him about the farm, about her father dying 2 winters past of a fever that started in his lungs and finished him quickly, about the debt that had come with the property, about the way Missouri felt smaller every year. She told him she had received 30 letters and answered all of them in the negative, and that his was the only one she was answering differently, and that she wanted him to understand she was not making any promises either. She told him she was curious about the Box Elder Creek and about the country that was nothing like Missouri. She told him she was 24 years old, brown-haired, plain-spoken, and reasonably good at arithmetic, which she had heard was useful in running cattle operations. She told him she did not expect him to be an easy man to know, because easy men had never particularly interested her. She sealed the envelope and set it on the table and went to bed, and when she woke up the next morning she read what she had written before she mailed it to make sure she had not said anything in the candlelight that daylight made her regret. She had not. She mailed it. She did not expect a quick reply. The territory was a long way from Missouri, and she imagined the mail traveled slowly between a small town like Harland and anywhere else. But 3 weeks later, at the very beginning of December, an envelope arrived addressed in that deliberate, practical handwriting, and Annie sat down at the kitchen table with her coat still on, and her boots still muddy from the walk to the post office, and read every word of it without moving. He wrote that he had read her letter several times, which was not something he typically admitted, but which seemed like the honest thing to say. He wrote that the Box Elder Creek froze in January, but only along the edges, and that in the spring it ran clear and fast enough to hear from the house with the windows open. He wrote about the cattle, a herd of about 200 head, mostly longhorn crosses, and about a horse named Cassius who was the most contrary animal he had ever owned and also the best working horse he had ever ridden, and about how those two qualities coexisted in that horse in a way that had taught him something about not expecting things to be simple. He wrote that he had a man named Elias who worked the ranch with him, a former Buffalo soldier who had come west after the army and settled in the territory, and that Elias was the most capable person Jedediah had ever known, and also the person most likely to tell him when he was being a fool, which happened with some regularity. He wrote that the nearest town, Harland, had a general store, a church, a school, a saloon, a livery, and a doctor who was more reliable than most and less reliable than you would want in an emergency, and that there were perhaps 200 people within riding distance who might reasonably call themselves neighbors. He asked her about arithmetic. He said that yes, arithmetic was indeed useful in running a cattle operation, and that if she had a head for numbers he would be interested to know how she had come by it, because most of the people he knew in the territory regarded numbers as a necessary evil rather than a subject worth knowing. Annie answered him. She explained that her father had been a schoolteacher before he took on the farm, and that she had grown up in a house full of books and a school of mind that treated questions as welcome things. She had helped her father with the farm's accounts from the time she was 14, and when he died, she had spent the better part of a year trying to make the numbers work before accepting that they would not. She told him about the school she had attended in St. Louis for 2 years, where she had studied reading, writing, arithmetic, and a bit of natural history, and where she had first learned that the world was considerably larger and more interesting than the county she had grown up in. She asked him about Ohio. She said he had declared that Ohio was enough said about itself, but she found she wanted to know more about a man who had left it. His next letter came faster, as though the distance between them had somehow shortened. He wrote about Ohio with the affectionate exasperation of a man describing a place he had loved enough to leave. He had been born in a small farming town east of Columbus, the second of 4 children, and his father had been the kind of farmer who looked at the same 40 acres every day of his life and found them sufficient. Jedediah had found them the opposite of sufficient from about the age of 12 onward, a restlessness that his father called ingratitude and his mother called spirit, and that Jedediah himself had never found a word for except west. He had gone west at 19, hired on with a cattle outfit in Texas, and worked the trail drives north for 4 seasons before saving enough to put a down payment on the New Mexico land. He had picked the Box Elder because of the creek, and because the grass was good, and because the man selling it was an honest one who told him exactly what was wrong with it, which turned out to be less than Jedediah had feared and more manageable than the man seemed to think. He was 30 now, and the ranch was paid, and the cattle were good, and he had built the house to 3 rooms from the original 1-room structure he had started in. And sometimes in the evenings when Elias had gone back to his own cabin and the fire had burned down, and the territory went quiet in that way it did at night, a quiet that was not like the quiet of Ohio or Missouri or anywhere east of the 100th meridian. Sometimes on those evenings, he found himself thinking that a man could build the right thing and still find himself lonely inside it. He had not meant to write that last part. He had written it and then looked at it for a long time and then left it in because the whole point of this correspondence, as far as he could see, was to tell the truth. Annie read that letter at the kitchen table and felt something move in her chest that she had not expected to feel. Something that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but some combination of the two that made her sit very still for a moment with the paper in her hands. She wrote back that she understood exactly what he meant about building the right thing and still finding yourself lonely inside it. She wrote that the farm was exactly that for her, the right thing turned into the wrong thing by the absence of the person it had been built for, and that she had spent 2 years rattling around in it like a stone in an empty jar. She told him she had been thinking seriously about the New Mexico territory, not just as an abstract possibility, but as a real place she might actually go, and that she wanted to ask him something directly because she believed he was a man who would appreciate directness. She asked him if he wanted her to come, not to be promised to him sight unseen, not to sign any papers or make any arrangements before they had stood in the same room and talked for more than the length of a letter, but to come as herself, to see the box elder and the creek and the country that was nothing like Missouri, and to let both of them decide from there what was true. She sealed that letter and held it in her hands for a while before she put it in her coat pocket to mail, because she understood that sending it meant she was serious, and she wanted to be sure she was serious before she committed to it. She thought about it for the better part of a day, walking the farm, looking at the bare fields and the fence posts she could not afford to replace, and the house that had been her father's and that now felt like a garment she had outgrown. Then she walked to the post office and mailed it. His answer came in 2 weeks, which she later learned was faster than the mail usually moved between Harland and anywhere, and she wondered if he had written it the same night he received hers. He wrote that yes, he wanted her to come. He wrote that he wanted to be clear about what she would be coming to, because he thought clarity was kinder than optimism. The house was warm but not large. The country was beautiful in a way that required a particular kind of looking, not the green softness of Missouri, but the stark, extraordinary clarity of a place that made no effort to be gentle. The work was real and constant, and the territory was still raw in ways that could surprise a person from the East. There were people of good character in Harland and people of less good character, as was true everywhere, and there had been trouble in the region with certain land disputes that he hoped were past their worst, but could not promise were finished. He wrote that he was not a demonstrative man by nature, which he hoped was not the same thing as a cold one. He wrote that Elias had read the letters, because Elias read everything that came through the box elder and Jedediah had given up asking him not to, and that Elias had said Miss Hadley sounded like a woman with good sense, and that good sense was the most durable quality a person could have, and that Jedediah ought not to waste it with his usual excessive caution. He wrote that spring would be the best time to come, when the country was at its most welcoming. He would arrange for her to stay at the home of a woman named Martha Colfax in Harland, who was the wife of the general store owner and a person of absolute respectability, so that Annie would have a proper situation and not feel that coming to look at the territory was the same as making a commitment she had not yet decided on. He wrote that he was glad she had written. The following months, January and February of 1883, passed in a sustained correspondence that Annie later thought of as the most unusual courtship in the history of Missouri. They wrote each other twice a week when the mail cooperated, and the letters grew longer and less formal and more genuinely themselves, two people discovering the shape of each other through the medium of language across a distance of well over 1,000 miles. She learned that he had read everything he could get his hands on since he was a boy, that he had opinions about the cattle industry that put him at odds with some of the larger operators in the region, that he drank coffee in the morning and occasionally whiskey in the evening, and nothing else on principle, that he had once set a broken leg for a calf during a difficult birth in conditions that he described with more clinical detail than was strictly necessary, and that she found she liked him for, because it told her something about how he handled hard things. He learned that she had once kept a garden that had been the envy of everyone on her road, that she had a sister in Indianapolis who was married to a man Annie described as decent enough but insufficiently curious about the world, that she had strong opinions about the proper preparation of biscuits, that she could ride a horse adequately but not well and was willing to improve, that she was not a person who cried easily but that she was not ashamed of the times she did. By the time March arrived and she began making the practical arrangements for the journey, Annie Hadley had concluded that she was already more than halfway in love with a man she had never seen. She thought this was either the most natural thing in the world or the most foolish, and she was not entirely sure which, but she packed her trunk regardless. She sold what she could of the farm equipment and livestock, enough to settle the most pressing debts and purchase a train ticket from St. Louis to Santa Fe with the connecting stages to Harland. She left the farm in the hands of the bank, which was not a dignified resolution, but was an honest one. She said goodbye to her aunt, who wept and pressed a Bible into her hands and made her promise to write. She wrote her sister a letter that her sister answered with a letter full of concern and very little understanding of why Annie might want to do this, which confirmed for Annie that she and her sister had always been differently constituted people who loved each other across a fundamental gap of temperament. She left St. Louis on the 15th of April, 1883, on a train that smelled of coal smoke and the particular anxiety of people in motion. The journey took 9 days in total, with the train to Santa Fe taking the better part of a week, and the stage from Santa Fe to Harland taking 2 more days over roads that were sometimes roads, and sometimes just the general suggestion of a direction. Annie sat in the stagecoach next to a man from Ohio who was going to Albuquerque to sell mining equipment, and a woman from Georgia who was going to join her son in Silver City, and who told Annie 3 times that she was very brave, which Annie found she did not quite know how to receive. The territory came at her gradually through the stage windows, the landscape shifting from the Green River country near the Rio Grande to something harder and broader and more demanding of attention. The sky was a different thing out here than it was in Missouri. In Missouri, the sky was something you looked up at occasionally. Out here it was a presence, vast and unambiguous, pressing down on the land with a kind of authority that made everything below it feel both small and exactly the right size. She understood what he had meant about the particular kind of looking it required. It was not a soft country, but it was honest in its way, and she found she respected that. The stage pulled into Harland at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late April, and the town was smaller than she had imagined and larger than she had feared. There was a main street of packed dirt with a row of false-fronted wooden buildings on either side, a water trough in front of the general store, 3 horses hitched to a rail outside the saloon, and a church at the far end of the street whose whitewash was fresh enough to suggest recent community ambition. Mountains rose behind the town in every direction, blue-gray and definitive. Martha Colfax met the stage. She was a broad, practical woman in her 40s, with a face that had weathered without hardening and eyes that took in Annie with swift, kind assessment. She said that Annie must be Miss Hadley, and that she had a room ready, and that supper was at 6, and that Jed Brenner had stopped by that morning to ask if the stage had come yet, which he had done also on Tuesday, though Martha did not tell Annie that until later. He came the next morning. Annie had not slept well, not from fear exactly, but from a particular species of alertness that her body had decided was the appropriate response to the most significant day of her life so far. She was dressed and at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when Martha said quietly that a man had ridden up to the gate, and Annie stood up and went to the window. He was taller than she had pictured from the letters, or perhaps it was the horse that made him seem so, a bay gelding that was not Cassius but a calmer animal, standing quiet while the man dismounted with the unhurried ease of someone who had spent most of his adult life on horseback. He was broad across the shoulders in a practical way, not the decorative broadness of a man who knew he was being looked at, but the kind that came from 6 years of lifting and building and working in all weather. He wore a plain brown coat and a hat that had seen better days, and he stood at the gate for a moment after tying the horse and looked at the house with an expression that Annie, watching through the window, could not entirely read. Then he knocked. She opened the door. They looked at each other for a moment that felt longer than it was, two people who knew each other thoroughly through language and not at all in person, standing in the thin morning light and trying to match the voice they had heard in their heads with the face in front of them. He said, "Miss Hadley." She said, "Mr. Brenner." He said, "You made it." She said, "I did." He asked if she would like to see the ranch, and she said yes. And Martha Colfax came out to tell Jedediah to bring the lady back by supper, and he said he would. And Martha gave him a look that meant she was observing all of this carefully and would have opinions about it later, which he received with the equanimity of a man who was accustomed to Martha Colfax having opinions about things. He had brought a horse for her from the livery, a gentle sorrel mare with a patient disposition, and he helped Annie mount with the practical courtesy of a man who had made up his mind to be useful without making a production of it. They rode out of Harland toward the box elder in the late morning light, and he told her about the land as they rode through it, not pointing out landmarks as though he were showing her a painting, but talking about it the way a person talks about something they have spent a long time learning, with the particular intimacy of knowledge. He told her where the creek ran and where it flooded in spring, and what the flooding did to the graze on the southern pasture. He told her about the 2 sections of land he had added in the 4th year when the neighboring homesteader had gone back east, and about the arrangement he had with a man named Royce who ran sheep on the eastern edge in exchange for help with the fence lines. He told her that the mountains to the north were called the Sangre de Cristo Range, and that the name meant blood of Christ, which the Spanish priests had given them on account of the color they turned at sunset, and that in his experience the name was accurate. The mountains went red as anything in the last light, and it happened every evening without exception, which he had always found it difficult not to regard as some kind of statement about the nature of the world. Annie listened and asked questions and watched the country change around her as they rode, the sage and chamisa coming into early color, the sky above them doing exactly what he had described, that enormous present-tense sky that did not apologize for what it was. The box elder itself came into view around a long curve of the creek, and she pulled up her horse without meaning to, because the sight of it surprised her in a way she had not anticipated. It was not a grand establishment. The house was adobe, low and thick-walled, with a wooden porch that he had built the previous summer, and there was a solid-looking barn and a corral, and the beginning of a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that had been recently turned and planted, and was just beginning to show green. The creek ran along the far edge of the property, cottonwood trees following its line, and the whole thing sat in a wide bowl of land that the mountains rose around on 3 sides, so that it had a feeling of shelter without enclosure, held without being confined. She said, "It is exactly what you described." He said, "I tried to be accurate." She said, "You were." But accuracy did not prepare me for what it actually looks like. He looked at it with her for a moment, the way you sometimes look at a thing you see every day when a stranger's eyes remind you to see it again. He said, "It does something to the light, the way it sits in the land like that." Elias says the land cupped its hands and held it. She looked at him. She said, "Elias sounds like a man worth knowing." He said, "He is the best man I know. He will be here this afternoon, and I hope you will meet him." They rode down to the ranch, and he showed her the house, walking her through the 3 rooms with the same practical honesty that had characterized his letters, explaining what worked and what he intended to improve, and what was simply what it was. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting room, with a cast-iron stove and a table and 2 chairs, and a bookshelf that was overcrowded in a way that told her immediately something important about who lived there. She went straight to the bookshelf, the way she always went to bookshelves, reading the titles with the absorption of a person who could not help herself. He watched her do it from across the room and did not say anything. She turned around and found him watching her and felt the color come up in her face, not from embarrassment exactly, but from the peculiar sensation of being seen doing something private. She said, "I have always been this way about books. I apologize." He said, "Do not apologize. You went straight to the one thing in this house that I am most interested to see you respond to." She said, he said, "and I think you might actually want to be here." It was the most direct thing he had said to her so far, and she understood that it cost him something to say it, that a man who had learned to be careful with hope did not put it out plainly without some effort. She said, "I think I might actually want to be here too." Elias Washington arrived at the Box Elder around 3 in the afternoon, and he was not what Annie had expected, though she realized upon reflection that she had not formed a clear picture of him from the letters, only a sense of his quality. He was perhaps 35, a tall man with a careful, attentive way of moving and eyes that were direct without being aggressive, the eyes of someone who had seen a considerable amount of the world and decided to keep watching it with interest. He had served in the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, and come to the territory after his discharge, and found Jedediah Brenner looking for a capable hand at a time when Elias was looking for good land to work, and they had arrived at an arrangement that Elias described to Annie, when she asked him about it, as the most equitable working partnership he had been party to in his adult life. He shook Annie's hand with the direct respect of a man who had decided opinions about women who came to the territory to see for themselves, and he said it was good to meet her, and she said it was good to meet him. And then Elias looked at Jedediah and said in a tone of perfect casualness that the south fence line needed attention before the week was out. Jedediah said it would get attention. Elias said good, and then excused himself to see to the horses, and Annie looked at Jedediah and said, "Does he always communicate at 2 levels simultaneously like that?" Jedediah said, "Usually at 3. You are only hearing 2 of them." She laughed, and it was the first time she had laughed since arriving in the territory, not the polite amusement she had managed on the stage or the social laughter of the evening with Martha, but the real thing that came up from somewhere genuine, and he heard it, and his expression shifted in a way that she catalogued carefully, that slight softening around the eyes that a man did when something surprised him into being pleased. They rode back to Harland as the sun dropped behind the mountains, and the mountains did what he had said they would, went red and then deeper red, and then the color of something heated almost past itself, and Annie stopped her horse on the road and watched it happen without trying to describe it to herself, just letting it be what it was. He stopped beside her and did not say anything either, and they sat on their horses in the cooling air and watched the mountains burn and fade, and it was the most comfortable silence Annie had been in since her father died. She stayed in Harland for 3 weeks. She had told herself before she came that she would spend perhaps 10 days and then make her decision, and either go back to Missouri, which at this point meant going to Indianapolis to her sisters, or stay and see what staying meant. She stayed 3 weeks because there was always something else she wanted to understand, some other quality of the place, or the man that she needed to see from one more angle before she could be sure. She went out to the box elder every other day. He showed her the cattle operation, explained the way the herd moved between pastures through the seasons, showed her the account books, which were kept in a neat but not sophisticated system that she could see places to improve immediately, and kept her mouth shut about for the first week, because she did not think it was her place, yet to reorganize a man's books within the first few days of knowing him in person. On the 8th day he asked her what she thought of the accounts. She told him with the directness he had asked for, everything she thought, which took about 20 minutes and required her to show him 3 places where the system was losing track of things and 2 places where a simple adjustment would save him hours of work at the end of each month. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and at the end he said, "You should have said something a week ago." She said, "I was waiting to see if you actually wanted to know." He said, "I want to know." She said, "Then I will tell you things when I see them." He said, "That is all I would ask." That was the day she started to think that this was real. Not just the letters, not just the country, but the specific arrangement of qualities that made up this man, and the way they interacted with the specific arrangement of qualities that made up her. The particular satisfaction of 2 people who were both honest and both capable sitting down to solve a problem together. The way the work between them did not have the quality of performance but of actual function. She met the town of Harland properly during those 3 weeks. She attended the church on Sunday, where a preacher named Aldridge delivered a reasonable sermon, and the congregation assessed her with the alert interest of a small community receiving a newcomer. She met the Colfax family properly. Arthur Colfax, who ran the store with the quiet competence of a man who had found his true vocation, and their daughter Sarah, who was 16 and desperately curious about Annie's life in St. Louis, and asked questions about trains and department stores with an eagerness that made Annie feel older than she was in a good way. She met a woman named Constance Drury, who was the school teacher and the most broadly educated person in Harland, and who talked to Annie about natural history and the territories in a way that felt like rain after a long, dry stretch. She met a man named Purvis who ran the saloon, and who was considerably more thoughtful than his establishment suggested. She met the doctor, a man named Haynes, who was indeed more reliable than most and less reliable than you would want in a genuine emergency, exactly as Jedediah had said. She noticed, in those 3 weeks, the way the territory was still being made. The injustice of it was not invisible to her. The Apache families who had been pushed to the edges of lands they had occupied for generations. The complexity of the Mexican land grant disputes that had left some families established and others dispossessed according to the particular turn of legal fortune. The black men and women who had come west looking for something more equitable than what they had left in the South, and who found freedom of a particular qualified kind. Wider in some ways and narrowed in others. She talked with Elias about this, one afternoon when they were mending the south fence line, and Jedediah had gone back to the barn for more wire. Elias spoke about it without bitterness, and without pretending it was simpler than it was, and he said that the territory was not innocent, and that any person who came to it with open eyes needed to understand what they were part of, the taking and the making, and the ordinary human effort to build something decent in conditions that were not always decent. She told him she thought he was right, and that she appreciated him saying it plainly. He said he appreciated her hearing it plainly, and that Jed was lucky, though he said the word luck in a tone that suggested he meant something more than chance. She understood why Jedediah called him the best man he knew. On the 15th day, Jedediah took her to see the part of the box elder property that ran along the creek in the cottonwood shade, and the creek was doing what he had described in January, running clear and fast enough to hear from some distance away, making the sound that running water makes in a dry country, which is a different and more urgent sound than running water makes anywhere green. The cottonwoods were in early leaf. that particular translucent spring green that lasts only a few weeks before deepening into summer color. And the whole corridor of trees along the creek had the quality of a separate world, cool and filtered and moving. They had been walking for some time in an easy quietness when he stopped and looked at the water and said, without turning to look at her, that he wanted to ask her something, and that he wanted her to know that her answer would not change anything between them, that he had meant it when he said no promises and he meant it still, and that whatever she decided was the right decision. She waited. He turned and looked at her, and in the cottonwood light, in the sound of the creek and the calling of some bird she did not know the name of, she saw for the first time what the letters had never quite conveyed, the particular quality of his attention when it was fully on her, which was something she had very little experience of, and which made her feel simultaneously more seen and more steady than she had felt since her father died. He said, "I think you should stay. I am not promising you anything except that I will be honest with you, and I will work as hard as I know how, and I will not pretend to be simpler than I am. I think you already know what I am asking you, and I think you already know what you are going to say, but I wanted to say it out loud in a real place instead of in a letter, because I think some things need to be said where they can be heard." She said, "Yes, just that. Yes." He looked at her for a moment as though checking that she meant it, and she looked back at him with the same steadiness she had felt in the cottonwood light. And then he reached out and took her hand, carefully, the way you take something you do not want to drop, and she let him. And they stood by the Box Elder Creek with the water running past them, and the mountains very far away and very close at the same time, in the particular fashion of mountains in that country. They were married in the Harland church on the 22nd of May, 1883, which was a warm and clear morning, with the mountains showing their full height in the unclouded air. Martha Colfax organized the reception in the churchyard with the decisive efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for an occasion worth organizing, and Constance Drury played the small organ that the church had received as a donation from a mining family the previous year. Elias stood beside Jedediah with the composed dignity of a man who was genuinely moved, and was managing it with the same quality he brought to everything else. Sarah Colfax could not stop smiling and kept whispering to her mother things that made her mother pat her arm and tell her to hush. Annie wore a dress she had brought from St. Louis, a good blue wool that had been her best dress for 4 years, and that she had never before worn to anything that felt sufficiently important to deserve it. She had done her hair simply, because she was not a woman who could spend an hour on her hair without losing patience with the project, and she stood in the door of the church in the May morning and breathed in the air of the New Mexico territory, which smelled of sage and dust and the faint sweetness of something flowering on the hillside, and she thought that this was the most herself she had felt in years, standing here on the edge of a life she had not yet lived in a place she was still learning to see. He was waiting for her at the front of the church with the careful stillness of a man who was feeling more than he was showing, which she had by now learned to read as well as she read his letters. When she walked down the aisle toward him, he looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, not the performative adoration of a man who knew he was being watched, but the true and helpless regard of someone who could not believe his particular luck. Preacher Aldridge read the service with a suitable gravity, and when the moment came to speak the vows, Jedediah Brenner said his with the quiet, deliberate conviction of a man who had thought about every word and meant all of them, and Annie Hadley, who was in the process of becoming Annie Brenner, said hers with the same. The reception in the churchyard went on until the afternoon grew long. There was food that the women of Harland had contributed with the competitive generosity of a community that took its collective efforts seriously. And there was music from a fiddle player named Garrett who had come down from the neighboring ranching district for the occasion, and who played with a joyful recklessness that made even the most restrained members of the congregation inclined toward movement. Elias danced with Constance Drury, who turned out to be a considerably better dancer than the scholarly sedateness of her usual manner suggested, and they made a handsome pair under the churchyard cottonwood tree, and several people noticed. Jedediah did not dance, because he had told Annie at some point in the letters that he was a man who could not dance without considerable personal embarrassment, and she had told him that she considered honesty about one's limitations to be more attractive than the pretense of false competence. And so he stood beside her at the edge of the dancing, and she held his arm, and they watched the afternoon happen around them with the particular contentment of two people who had found the place they belonged and were standing in it. They went home to the box elder as the sun was getting low, and the mountains did their evening thing, and Annie watched it for the first time as someone who lived there, which was a different experience than watching it as a visitor. It felt like being included in something that had been happening without her. The first year of the marriage was one of the most instructive periods of Annie Brenner's life, not because it was difficult, though parts of it were, but because she discovered the difference between understanding something and actually doing it, between knowing the shape of a life and living inside its texture every day. She had read about cattle ranching in a general way, and she had seen it through Jedediah's description and her 3 weeks of observation. But there was a considerable distance between observation and the year-round reality of a working ranch in the New Mexico Territory in 1883. The summer was harder than she had prepared herself for, not brutally so, but insistently. The heat that settled into the land in July and stayed, the dryness that turned the creek to a quieter version of itself and made the graze shorter than ideal. The way the cattle had to be watched more carefully when it was dry because they would push through fence lines to find better grass. She learned to work in the early morning and late afternoon, and to regard the middle of the day as a time for indoor things, mending and accounts and correspondence. She learned the names of the hands that Jedediah hired on for the summer work, a young Mexican man named Santos, who was one of the most skilled ropers she had ever seen, and who taught her a few basics with a patience that was both professional and kind, and 2 brothers named Cook from somewhere in Texas who worked hard and talked little and were gone by September. She reorganized the accounts properly, with Jedediah's full cooperation, and when she was done, they could see at a glance what the ranch was doing at any point in the year, which turned out to be doing considerably better than the old system had made apparent. This discovery pleased Jedediah in the way that practical improvements pleased a practical man, deeply but without fanfare, and he told her she had done something valuable, which coming from him was as good as an extravagant compliment from anyone else. She wrote letters to Martha Colfax when she was not seeing her in person during the weekly trips to town for supplies, and she wrote regularly to Constance Drury, who had become the closest thing to a confidant she had in Harland, and she wrote to her aunt in Missouri, and occasionally to her sister in Indianapolis, whose letters back remained affectionate and slightly baffled by the life Annie had chosen, which Annie had made her peace with. She and Jedediah talked in the evenings. This was perhaps the thing she had been least sure about before she came, whether the man whose voice she knew from paper would be the same man whose voice filled the room she was sitting in, whether the quality of his mind would translate from written words to spoken ones. It did. It translated completely. He was quieter in speech than in letters, more inclined to let her talk and ask questions and respond to them in the measured way of someone who thought before speaking. But the thought was always worth the measure, and she found that the evenings at the box elder, with the fire going and the sound of the territory settling into night outside the thick adobe walls, were the best part of every day without exception. He read to her when they had finished talking, or she read to him, working through the overcrowded bookshelf and supplementing it with whatever Constance Drury could lend them, and whatever came through the dry goods catalogs in the way of new titles. They disagreed about books with the comfortable vigor of 2 people who both read seriously, and did not see any reason to pretend that their opinions were less than they were, and the disagreements were among the best conversations they had, better even than the agreements. Elias remained the most important presence in their working life aside from each other, and Annie came to regard him with the particular warmth she reserved for people she genuinely admired. She watched, with a quiet interest that she was careful not to make into nosiness, the increasing frequency with which Elias found occasion to visit the schoolhouse during the hours when Constance Drury might be found there alone, grading papers or preparing lessons, or simply having a cup of tea in the small room at the back that served as a schoolteacher's office and refuge. Constance was 32 and had come to the territory from Virginia 6 years ago, with a conviction that education in the Western Territories was work worth doing, and she had found it so. And she had also found that the territories offered a social latitude that Virginia had not, a relative freedom from the suffocating rigidities of the world she had grown up in. She and Elias moved toward each other with the deliberate care of two people who were taking nothing for granted in a world that had given both of them reason not to. And Annie watched it and thought about her own 31st letter, and felt a great tenderness for the way some things found their shape slowly and honestly. Constance and Elias married the following spring, a quiet ceremony with only a handful of witnesses because they preferred it that way, and the whole of Harland accepted it with the varying degrees of welcome that reflected the actual range of human character in any small community. Some people genuinely glad and some people quietly disapproving, and most people somewhere in the practical middle. And Elias and Constance went on living their lives in the territory with the same capable dignity they had always brought to it. The autumn of 1883 brought the first serious difficulty that Annie and Jedediah faced together. A man named Talbot, who operated a much larger cattle outfit some 15 miles to the east, had been in a long-running dispute with several of the smaller ranchers in the region about water rights on a seasonal creek that fed through 3 properties before reaching the main river. The dispute had been simmering for 2 years, and in October it arrived at the box elder in the form of Talbot's foreman, a man named Driscoll, appearing at the gate and informing Jedediah that Talbot intended to fence the upper portion of the creek that ran through Talbot land, which would effectively redirect the water away from the smaller properties downstream. Annie was in the yard when Driscoll came, working in the kitchen garden that had by now achieved a genuine productivity, and she heard the conversation clearly. She heard the foreman's tone, which was not threatening exactly, but carried within it the confidence of someone who had practiced the art of making smaller people feel the size of their smallness. She heard Jedediah's response, which was quiet and specific and contained no wasted words, and she heard Driscoll ride away. Jedediah came back across the yard, and she could see in his face the particular expression he wore when he was thinking about something difficult with his full attention. She said, "Tell me everything." He told her everything. The water rights, the legal situation in the territory, which was complicated by the overlap of federal land policy and old Mexican land grant law, the practical reality that Talbot had significantly more resources and legal access than the smaller operations, and that taking the matter to the territorial court was both necessary and uncertain. He told her that 3 of the other small ranchers along the creek were in the same position and that they would need to act together if they were going to act effectively. She said, "Then you should act together. Can you get them together this week?" He looked at her for a moment and she understood that he was not surprised by her response, only pleased by the directness of it. He said, "I can," she said, "good. And you should write to Santa Fe about the legal question immediately because whatever court this goes to, you want to have established your position formally before Talbot does." He said, "I was going to say exactly that." She said, "I know. I was saying it along with you." The water dispute lasted through the winter and into the following spring, and it involved a great deal of letter writing, which Annie took primary responsibility for because she was the better writer of the two, and because Jedediah, who understood the legal question clearly, was not a man who found the translation of legal understanding into persuasive formal language to be his strongest skill. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office and to a lawyer in Santa Fe that the Colfaxes recommended, a man named Ramirez who had handled several of the old land grant cases and knew the territory's legal landscape better than almost anyone. The matter resolved, finally, in the following March, in a finding by the Territorial Land Commissioner that the water rights on the seasonal creek were held in common by all the properties along its course, which meant Talbot could not fence the upper portion without violating the rights of the downstream properties. It was not a complete victory, because the legal situation in the territory was never complete anything, but it was sufficient, and the smaller ranchers were able to continue operating without the resource being cut off. After the finding came in, Jedediah sat at the kitchen table with the letter from the Land Commissioner's office and read it 3 times. Then he looked up at Annie, who was standing at the stove with her back to him, and he said her name in a tone that made her turn around. He said, "We won," she said. "We did." He said, "You wrote better letters than Ramirez." She said, "Ramirez knew the law. I knew how to say why it mattered." He said, "That is exactly right." And then he said, in the particular quiet of a man saying something that goes down to the roots of him, "I would not want to do any of this without you." She crossed the kitchen and put her hand against the side of his face, which was something she had discovered in the months of their marriage, was the gesture that meant more to him than almost any other, the simple warmth of her hand on his face in the particular way she placed it, and he put his hand over hers, and they sat like that for a moment in the kitchen of the Box Elder, the fire going in the stove, and the March wind in the territory doing its business outside the thick walls. And she thought that this was what she had been trying to find her whole life, without knowing that finding it looked like this. The spring of 1884 brought a discovery that Annie made on a morning in late February, a morning when the light was already longer, and the quality of the air had shifted towards something that was not yet warm but was no longer winter, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with the realization settling through her, and then she called Jedediah in from the yard. She told him directly, because she was not a woman who built up to things, and she watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, which was to give way entirely to something he could not manage, a pure uncomplicated joy that broke through every layer of his customary reserve and left him looking younger and more open and more entirely himself than she had ever seen. He said her name in a way that did not require anything else to follow it. Their son was born in October of 1884, a healthy and emphatic boy whom they named Thomas James Brenner, Thomas for Jedediah's father in Ohio and James for Annie's father, who had been James Hadley and who would have, Annie was certain, found the Box Elder and everything about it entirely satisfactory. Thomas arrived in the world in the middle of the night with Dr. Haynes in attendance and Martha Colfax, who had appointed herself to the task with the authority of someone not open to discussion on the matter, and Elias and Constance waiting in the kitchen with a pot of coffee, and a patience that Elias maintained considerably better than Constance, who was by nature an anxious person in situations where she could not take direct action. When it was done, and the baby was named and Dr. Haynes had gone home to sleep, Jedediah held his son in the gray pre-dawn light of the main room and looked at him with that expression Annie had been cataloging since the creek in the cottonwoods, that helpless regard that he could not manage into anything more composed, and he said very quietly, not to Annie but to the baby or to the room or to the general fact of things, "Look what we made." Thomas grew the way children grow in the territory, fast and curious, and acquainted with the outdoors before he was properly acquainted with the indoors. He rode with Jedediah from the time he was old enough to sit in front of a saddle, and he followed Elias around the property with the single-minded devotion of a small person who had identified the most competent adult in range and intended to learn everything from them. He was loud and cheerful and occasionally infuriating in the specific way of small boys who have decided that rules are interesting objects of inquiry rather than binding constraints. And Annie spent considerable portions of his early years looking at him, with the expression of a woman who loves someone completely, and also cannot believe what they have just done. She had her hands full with Thomas and the ranch and the accounts and the garden that had by now expanded into a genuine productive enterprise, providing not only the box elder's needs, but enough surplus to sell at the Harland market every Saturday. She was also teaching, informally at first, and then with the structure of something deliberate, the children of several ranch families in the area who were too far from Harland to attend Constance's school regularly. It began with 2 children and grew to 6 and then to 8, held twice a week in the main room of the box elder when the weather was poor and on the porch or in the yard when it was fine. And Annie taught them reading and arithmetic and a little natural history, and the particular lesson that learning itself was valuable, that curiosity was not a problem to be corrected, but the best quality a person could have. Constance was aware of it and supportive, having more children in the district than her school could comfortably handle, and the 2 women developed a working relationship that they both valued, sharing resources and ideas, and the specific satisfaction of doing something that mattered in a place where it was needed. Jedediah watched the teaching begin and grow, and said nothing about it except that the house was louder on school days, which he said without complaint, and that the children asked him questions when they arrived, and departed that he found himself actually wanting to answer. He rebuilt the porch that summer to be larger than the original, a fact that Annie noticed but did not comment on, because she had learned that he expressed affection most naturally through the things he built or improved or repaired, and that the new porch was his way of making room for what she was doing. By 1886, the box elder had grown to a point that required them to hire on a full-time second hand in addition to the seasonal workers, and they hired a young man named Pedro Fuentes, who was 19 and the nephew of Santos, who was still the most skilled roper in the district, and who vouched for his nephew with an affectionate directness that told them everything they needed to know. Pedro was serious and observant and took to the work with the wholehearted investment of a young person who has found the place they fit, and he became a reliable presence on the ranch, and eventually a kind of older brother to Thomas, which was a role Thomas received with the enthusiasm of a child who had been slightly lonely for company his own age and size. The summer of 1887 was when Annie found Jedediah's letters. She was not looking for them. She was reorganizing the storage chest in the bedroom, making room for Thomas's winter things now that he was big enough to need a proper drawer of his own, and she found a bundle at the bottom of the chest, tied with a piece of twine, that turned out to be her own letters to him. All of them, from the very first one she had sent in November of 1882, in her careful Missouri handwriting, arranged in order and kept. She sat on the edge of the bed and held them for a long time. She had kept his letters too, of course, in a box on the shelf in the main room where she kept the things she valued, and she had always known she kept them because she was not the kind of person who threw away something that had been important. But she had not known, or had not thought about, whether he kept hers, and finding that he did, and in this particular way, carefully preserved and ordered in the bottom of the chest, where he kept the things that were closest to him, was something that moved her in a way that surprised her even after 4 years of marriage to this man who expressed care through keeping and building and accuracy. She was still sitting there when he came in from the yard, and he saw what she was holding and stopped in the doorway with the particular expression of a man who has been found out in something private and is working out how to feel about it. She said, "All of them." He said, "All of them," she said, "even the first one where I introduced myself and then apologized for introducing myself when you already knew my name." He said, "Especially that one." She put the letters back in the bundle and set them on the chest, and stood up and crossed the room, and put her arms around him in the direct way she had always had. Not the tentative embrace of a person who was uncertain of their welcome, but the full certain claim of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. And he put his arms around her and held her in the way he had always held her, as though he had identified the exact configuration of the world that made sense to him and had no intention of releasing it. He said into her hair, "I was always afraid before you came that a place could be right and still be empty." She said, "It cannot be, not if you let the right person into it." He said, "I did not let you in. You walked in," she said. "You left the door open." He laughed, which was still the thing she loved most to provoke in him, because it was still the thing that he did most completely, without any of the careful management he applied to most of his emotional expressions. And she thought that she could spend the rest of her life working at this project, finding the things that made Jedediah Brenner laugh and not exhaust it. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1888, a girl this time, whom they named Clara Mee Brenner. Clara for no particular reason, except that both of them heard it, and thought it suited her before she was 2 days old, and me for Martha Colfax, who received the information that she had a namesake with the brisk efficiency of a woman who was going to feel this deeply, but was not going to make a production of feeling it. Clara was from her first weeks the opposite of Thomas in temperament, quiet and observant where Thomas had been loud and active, the kind of baby who seemed to be cataloging information about her environment with a precision that her mother recognized immediately and found both charming and slightly uncanny. She was going to be a reader. Annie knew it from the way Clara's eyes tracked print on a page before she was old enough to understand what print was. Thomas was 3.5 when Clara arrived and was initially uncertain about her before determining that she was an audience, which satisfied him considerably more than a competitor would have. He told her things. He brought her objects for her inspection and reported to her on the activities of the ranch with a narrating enthusiasm that made Elias, who witnessed it with the composed delight of a man who found children genuinely interesting, say that Thomas had apparently decided the baby was a very small and not yet mobile scholar who needed regular briefings. Annie kept teaching. By 1888, the informal school at the Box Elder had grown to 12 children on its regular days, and she had petitioned the territorial school board, through a letter that Constance reviewed and called very good indeed, for recognition as a satellite school serving the outlying ranch families, which would mean modest funding and the legitimacy of official designation. The petition was granted in 1889, and Annie became, with a mixed feeling of pride and amusement at the formality of it, an officially recognized schoolteacher in the New Mexico Territory. Jedediah built a proper schoolroom that autumn. Not large, but proper, with windows on 2 sides for good light and a proper stove, and enough bench space for 15 children. He built it on the east side of the house, where it could be reached from the yard without going through the house, which was practical, and he put the windows at the right height for children who were sitting down, which was the kind of thought that told her how carefully he had paid attention to what she was doing and what it needed. She stood in the doorway of the finished room on an October morning, with the smell of new wood and the territorial light coming through the clean windows, and she said, "You built a schoolroom." He said, "You needed one." She said, "You built a schoolroom for my school." He said, "It is your school. You should have a room for it that is worthy of it." She stood in the doorway for a moment with that fact, and she thought about the 30 letters and the one that had not promised her anything and the creek in the cottonwoods and all the evenings since, and this man who showed her what he felt by building things for her that she needed. And she thought that the life she had arrived at was not the life she had known enough to imagine, which was perhaps the best thing that could be said about it. The years continued in the way that good years do, full enough that they passed quickly but rich enough that they were not lost in the passing. Thomas grew into a boy of genuine character, serious when it mattered and light-hearted when he could be, with his father's deliberate quality of attention and his mother's directness, and a particular gift for mathematics that Annie nurtured with the proprietary pleasure of a teacher recognizing something she cares about in a student she loves. Clara grew into herself with the unhurried certainty of someone who had decided early on what she was about, which was books and questions, and the particular world of the natural sciences that Annie had introduced her to through the natural history shelf that had grown to take up a significant portion of the main room's bookshelf space. Elias and Constance had 2 children of their own, a boy named Marcus and a girl named Ruth, who were close in age to Thomas and Clara, and who grew up on the neighboring property with the easy familiarity of children who have known each other since before memory. The 4 of them formed a kind of loose confederacy of the Box Elder district, ranging across the properties and the creek and the edges of the surrounding country with the freedom of children, in a place where the land itself was a teacher. In the spring of 1891, Jedediah's father died in Ohio. The news came in a letter from his brother that took 3 weeks to arrive, which meant by the time Jedediah read it the funeral was long past. He stood at the kitchen table and read the letter twice, and Annie watched him do it, and she did not say anything until he set the letter down. He said, "I should have gone back more," she said. "I know," he said. "He was not an easy man. But he built what he had with everything he knew how to use, and I did not always credit that when I was young," she said. "You credit it now," he said. "I do. Everything I have done here, all of this, I understand it differently now that he is gone. I understand that I was doing the same thing he was doing, just in a different direction." She said, "You should write to your brother," he said. "I should write to my brother." He wrote the next morning, a long letter by his standards, and it was the beginning of a renewed correspondence with his family in Ohio that had been fitful for years, and that became, in the years following his father's death, something more regular and genuine. His brother Samuel came to visit in 1892, the first time Jedediah had seen him in more than a decade, and Samuel was a good-natured man who looked enough like Jedediah to be slightly unnerving, and who took to the territory with the sensible open interest of a person who has come to see something and is actually looking at it. He stayed for 3 weeks, during which he and Jedediah had the conversations that brothers who have been separated for a long time have when they finally find themselves in the same place again, the kind that start as the surface of things and gradually find their way to the actual terrain underneath. The old frictions and the old love and the accumulated understanding that comes from 2 people who have been the same age in the same family, and then gone out into the world and become very different versions of the people they started as. Samuel went back to Ohio saying that the territory was not for him, which was honest, and that he understood now why Jedediah had gone west and stayed west, which mattered more. He was fond of Annie, whom he called a remarkable woman in a tone that suggested he had not expected remarkable, and was pleased to have been surprised. And he told Thomas and Clara that their father had chosen well in all things, which Thomas received with the easy agreement of a child who had never considered the possibility that his father might have chosen otherwise, and Clara received with the thoughtful expression of a girl who was already old enough to understand that choice was the interesting part. The territory itself was changing around them through the 1890s, the raw edges softening in some ways and sharpening in others, the railroad reaching closer, and the towns growing, and the old wildness being pushed outward from the settled centers without disappearing entirely, still present in the country beyond, and in the qualities it had given to the people who had lived in it long enough to be shaped by it. Annie felt this change as something that was both loss and progress in the complicated way that most real changes were, and she wrote about it in the letter she sent to Constance Drury, who had become a correspondent when they were not neighbors, having moved to Santa Fe with Elias in 1890, when Elias had accepted a position with the Territorial Land Office that made use of his considerable knowledge of the region's geography and history. The school at the Box Elder continued. It had grown to serve 18 children by 1893, a number that required Annie to organize her days very carefully, and that left her, on some evenings, more tired than she would have admitted to anyone except Jedediah, who knew it the way he knew most things about her, which was completely and without needing to be told. On those evenings, he made the coffee himself and brought it to her in the chair by the fire and sat across from her, and sometimes talked and sometimes did not, and both were equally comfortable, which she had decided years ago was the most reliable sign of the right companionship, the ability to be silent together without the silence becoming something to fill. Thomas turned 16 in 1900 and was by then doing the full work of the ranch alongside his father and Pedro Fuentes, who had been at the box elder for 14 years by that point, and was as much a part of the property as the buildings or the creek. Thomas had his father's ease with horses, and his mother's ease with numbers, and a natural authority with cattle that Jedediah said was a gift rather than a learned thing, the kind of instinctive understanding of animal behavior that some people simply had. He was also, by 16, beginning to think about the world beyond the box elder with the same restless, horizon-directed curiosity that had sent his father west from Ohio at 19, which Annie watched with a mixture of recognition and the particular bittersweetness of a parent who has raised someone well enough that they need to go find out what well enough can do. She told Jedediah this one evening, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said that he supposed the apple had not fallen far, and she said that the apple had fallen in exactly the right place and was simply rolling in the natural direction, and he said that was a generous way to look at it, and she said she had always found generosity to be the accurate position when it came to the people she loved. Clara was 12 in 1900, and had already read everything on both bookshelves, and was supplementing with regular orders from a bookseller in Santa Fe that Constance Drury had recommended. She was going to be a teacher or a scientist or possibly both, and she had informed her parents of this at age 10 with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has identified her inclination and sees no reason to be uncertain about it. Annie had found this deeply satisfying. Jedediah had found it entirely characteristic. They had both been right. In the autumn of 1901, Jedediah turned 49. Annie was 43. They had been married 18 years, which was longer than either of them had been alive before they met, which was a thought that Annie occasionally took out and considered with a kind of wondering appreciation, the way you appreciate something large by trying to measure it. On the evening of Jedediah's birthday, after the children had gone to bed and the ranch was quiet in the way it got quiet in the deep autumn, the territory settling into itself with the year's urgency gone, they sat together on the porch that he had built larger all those years ago, in the cold, clear air, with a blanket across their laps and the mountains very dark against the dark sky, and the stars doing what stars did in this country, which was everything. She said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me," she said. "When I read your letter, the first one, I thought the fact that you did not promise me anything was a kind of courage. I thought here is a man who is honest enough to know that promises across a distance are not real and brave enough to say that instead of saying what he thought I wanted to hear. And I thought it was the most attractive thing I had ever read from a stranger." He said, "It was not courage. It was just that I did not know what I was promising. I only knew what was true." She said, "I know, that is the courage." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars with the quality of attention he brought to things that mattered. Then he said, "I want to tell you something too." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I was afraid, for a long time before your letter came, not of anything I could name specifically, but of the general shape of ending up somewhere true and alone in it. I was afraid that I had built the right thing around the wrong absence. And then your letter came, and it was the most like a person I had ever heard anyone sound in writing, and I understood that the absence I was living inside had a specific shape, and that shape was yours." She sat with that for a moment, with the stars and the mountains and the 18 years between who they had been and who they were. She said, "I am still here." He said, "You are here. You are entirely here." She took his hand the way she had taken it on the day he asked her to stay, carefully, as though she was aware of its value, and he held hers in the way he had always held it, as something he was not going to drop, and they sat on the porch of the Box Elder in the October dark of 1901, while the territory went about its business around them, unhurried and enormous and real. The following years brought Thomas into the full partnership of the Box Elder, which Jedediah formalized in 1903 when Thomas was 19, a young man of character and capability who had decided that the horizon he wanted to reach was not as far as his grandfather's Ohio or as unfamiliar as his father's West, but was instead the very land beneath his feet deepened and expanded by his own effort. He and Pedro Fuentes, who was by now 37 and one of the most knowledgeable stockmen in the district, worked the cattle operation with an efficiency that freed Jedediah to do something he had been wanting to do for years, which was to improve the water situation on the northern pasture with a proper diversion from the Box Elder Creek. A project that he had been planning mentally since approximately 1886, and that he set to work on with the focused pleasure of a man returning to a long-considered problem. Annie continued to teach. Her school was recognized by the new state of New Mexico in 1912 when statehood came, and she attended the statehood celebrations in Harland with the particular emotion of a person who had become part of a place through the full weight of lived time, and was now watching that place take on its formal identity in the world. She had come to this territory as a stranger with a trunk and a letter, and the conviction that honesty was worth more than promises, and she had spent 30 years building herself into it, teaching its children and keeping its accounts, and knowing its creek and its mountains and its sky through every season and every quality of light. Clara went to the New Mexico Normal University in 1907 at 19, the first in the family to attend a formal university, and she came back 3 years later with a teaching certificate and a passionate interest in the natural sciences, and a fierceness of intellectual engagement that her mother recognized as the thing she had always seen in her, and her father recognized as the thing that had never surprised him about her. She taught at the Harland School for a year before taking a position in Santa Fe, where she found her footing in a city that was large enough to hold the scope of her ambitions, and she wrote letters home that Annie read at the kitchen table with the same absorption she had always brought to reading things that mattered. In 1910, when Annie was 52 and Jedediah was 58, and the Box Elder was producing better than it ever had, and Thomas was running most of the daily operation with a confidence and competence that his parents both found they could simply trust, Jedediah came in from the north pasture one afternoon in September and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Annie with an expression she had not seen before, which was not alarming but was the specific look of a man who was about to say something that had been waiting a long time to be said. He said, "I want to take you somewhere," she said. "Where?" he said. "I want to take you to see Ohio." She looked at him. She understood that this was not a simple thing, that it had layers she needed to respect, the long ago leaving and the not going back and the father gone and the country changed, and the man he was now looking back at the man he had been. She said, "Tell me why now." He said, "Because I have been here long enough to know I will not want to go back forever, because Samuel is still there and his children are there and I have never met them. Because I want to show you where I came from since you have spent 30 years showing me where you were going." She said, "Will you find it changed?" He said, "Everything is changed. That is not the question." She said, "What is the question?" He said, "Whether I can look at it and be glad I left, properly glad, without regret, knowing that it made everything after possible." She said, "Yes." He said, "You have not been to Ohio." She said, "I will go if you will go." I said yes to your first question. I mean yes to this one too. They went in the spring of 1911, Thomas capable and unconcerned at the box elder, Pedro reliable and present as always, Clara available by telegram in any emergency. They took the train east, which was by 1911 a considerably more comfortable enterprise than the journey Annie had made west in 1883, and they sat in the rail car and watched the country change from the territory's austere magnificence to the green rolling middle distances of the eastern states, and Annie watched Jedediah watching it, the particular attention of a man retracing something. Ohio was smaller than the territory in the way that all closed things are smaller than open ones, but it was not without its quality, the full summer green of it, the particular smell of Midwestern farm country that Jedediah had carried in his memory for 30 years without knowing it. Samuel was at the station to meet them, gray-haired now and with the solid presence of a man settled in his place, and he and Jedediah stood on the platform for a moment before they shook hands and then, with the brief awkwardness of men who were not practiced at it, embraced. They spent 2 weeks in Ohio. They saw the farm that had been the Brenner family farm and was now Samuel's son's, the 40 acres that Jedediah's father had found sufficient, and that Jedediah's nephew was expanding with the next generation's ambition. They walked the property and Jedediah showed Annie the places he had known as a boy, the wood lot and the creek, which was a different creek with different water than the box elder, but which made the same sound that running water makes anywhere, the sound of things moving through the world in their particular direction. On the last evening before they went back, they sat on the porch of Samuel's house in the Ohio summer evening, and Jedediah was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was finding something out about himself. After a while he said that he had been afraid, coming back, that it would feel like a loss, like looking at what he had exchanged and finding the exchange regretted. And instead it felt like completion, like seeing the beginning of a thing from a place far enough along the story to understand the beginning's necessity. Annie said that was exactly the right way to feel about it. He said that she always said exactly the right thing. She said she did not always say the right thing, but she had had 30 years of practice saying things to him specifically, which was its own education. He said that was a generous way to describe it. She said, again, that she had always found generosity to be the accurate position when it came to the people she loved. He looked at her in the Ohio evening light, which was a softer light than the light of the territory but not therefore a lesser one, and she looked at him with all the certainty she had accumulated across all those years, the certainty that had begun with a letter that promised her nothing and had kept its word, because in the absence of promises had been the presence of something better, the ongoing reality of a man and a woman who had decided together, without guarantees, to see what was true. They went home to the box elder in July of 1911. The mountains were still there. The creek was still running. Thomas had managed the summer work with the complete competence of someone who had been properly prepared for it, and Pedro met them at the gate with the quietly satisfied expression of a man reporting mission accomplished. The kitchen garden was producing abundantly, and the porch was sturdy, and the 3-room house that had become 4 rooms that year, when Thomas had added a proper bedroom off the back now, contained 18 years of books and 2 children's growing up and everything that had been brought to it and built within it. Annie walked through the gate and across the yard and stood on the porch and looked out at the country, the sage and the chamisa and the mountains in their afternoon color, and she breathed in the air that was the specific combination of elements that meant this place and nowhere else. Jedediah came and stood beside her. She said, "We are home." He said, "We are home." They stayed on the porch for a while, as they had stayed on the porch for 30 years, in all the seasons and all the lights that the territory had to offer, and the mountains did what they always did as the sun fell behind them, went through all the colors between orange and red, and the deep burning that the Spanish priests had named with the name of the holiest thing they knew. And Annie watched it the way she had watched it that first evening on the road from the box elder to Harland. Only now it was not the evening of a stranger encountering a new world, but the evening of a woman in her own life looking at the place that had been hers for 30 years and feeling the truth of the possession in her bones. In the years that followed, the Box Elder went on being what it had always been, a working ranch on a creek in the New Mexico territory, running cattle and keeping accounts and tending a kitchen garden and educating the children of the district and building things that needed building. Thomas ran the operation, and it prospered in his hands. Clara came home for the summers and conducted her natural history observations in the territory with the organized enthusiasm of a woman who had found her work and intended to do it thoroughly. She found her own love in 1915, a geologist from the Territorial Survey named Marcus Washington, who happened to be Elias and Constance's son grown to a careful and distinguished man, and who had met Clara in Santa Fe through the particular route of two people who moved in the same circles of inquiry and kept encountering each other at the places where books and science and the questions that interested them most intersected, until the encountering became something that neither of them could stop doing without admitting that they did not want to. Jedediah said when he heard, with the straight face of a man delivering a line he had considered and was satisfied with, that it seemed the Box Elder's most important product was not cattle after all. Elias, who came out to the ranch with Constance for the announcement supper, said that he had always considered that a possibility. Annie looked at the two of them from across the table and thought about the creek in the cottonwoods and the first letter and all the evenings since, and she thought that the story of how she had come to be sitting at this table in this house with these people was the best story she knew, and that it had started with the fact that one man out of 31 had had the particular courage of honesty, the willingness to offer her nothing but the truth, and that the truth had turned out to be everything. Thomas married in 1916, a young woman from the Harland district named Rose Garza, the daughter of a ranching family who had been in the territory for 4 generations, who was 23, and had exactly the quality of character that Thomas's parents had not dared to hope for too specifically, but had quietly hoped for nonetheless. She came into the Box Elder with the ease of a person who recognized the place she fit, and she and Annie understood each other from very early on in the way that certain women understand each other, through the shared grammar of practicality and directness, and the capacity to love without making a diminishment of it. By 1918, there were grandchildren. Thomas and Rose's first was a boy they named James, for Annie's father, which made Annie sit down at the kitchen table for a minute when they told her, and simply be with the feeling of it. Clara and Marcus had a daughter the following year, a girl named Constance for her grandmother, who arrived in the world with the same observant quality that Clara had had as a baby, and that Annie recognized immediately, and with a pleasure that was entirely particular to the act of seeing something you love replicate itself in the next generation. Jedediah was 66 in 1918, and still working the ranch every day, though Thomas carried the heavier labor and Jedediah had shifted toward the planning and the management and the oversight that came with having spent 4 decades learning a piece of land. He was slower than he had been but not diminished, with the quality of a man who had been doing something for a very long time and had reached the layer of it that was below efficiency and above routine, the place where work becomes a form of knowing. Annie was 60 in 1918 and still teaching, though the formal school had been fully absorbed into the district system, and she now assisted the younger teacher, a capable woman named Flores, more than she ran the operation independently. She was also writing, something she had begun in her 50s more or less by accident, starting with letters to Clara about the territory that Clara had told her were too good to be only letters, and gradually expanding into a record of the Box Elder and the country and the people who had made it, not a formal history, but the kind of account that comes from someone who was present and paying attention and had the language to say what they saw. She did not know what would happen to what she was writing. It was possible it would stay in a box in the bedroom and be read by no one but Thomas and Clara and their children after she was gone, which seemed to her a reasonable fate for a record of a life. It was also possible it would find some other form, which she was not going to rule out. But the writing itself was the thing, the particular satisfaction of turning what she knew into something that could be passed on, the way her father had turned learning into something he could give her, and she had turned it into something she could give the children of the district. This long chain of what people carry forward into the world when they have been properly loved and properly taught. Jedediah read what she wrote. He always had been and still was the reader she most wanted to have, not because he praised it without consideration, but because his consideration was thorough and honest, and because when he said something was good, she knew exactly what he meant by good. He said once, reading a page she had written about the creek in the cottonwoods in the spring of their arrival, that she had gotten it exactly right, and that reading it was like standing there again. She said that was all she wanted it to do. He said that in his experience it was the most a writer could want and also the most difficult thing to achieve, and that she had achieved it. She said he was partial. He said he was not partial, he was precise, and that there was a difference she should not pretend not to know. She laughed, and he heard it, and he did the thing she had spent 37 years working at, which was to give way entirely to his own laughter without managing it. In the good, warm kitchen of the box elder with the fire and the stove, and the New Mexico winter doing its business outside, and the grandchildren asleep in the room that had been added, when Thomas and Rose moved into the main house, after the original house became too much to manage for two people who were no longer quite who they had been at 30. They were in the territory together for 38 years. They were in love for all of them, not always in the same key but always in the same chord, the complex harmony of two people who have chosen each other so many times across so many days that the choice becomes indistinguishable from the person, becomes what they are to each other, and in some sense what they are at all. The box Elder Creek ran along the southern edge of the property. The cottonwood stood along its banks and turned gold in October and bare in November, and then, every spring without exception, made the leap back into that first translucent green that Annie had been watching for 38 years, and that still made her go to the window when she saw it beginning. The mountains rose around the land in every direction and went through their colors at the end of every day, and were there in the morning when the light came back, unchanged in the way that only very large and very old things are unchanged, reliable in the way that the things you most love are reliable, not because nothing happens to them, but because they continue past what happens and are still there. The 31st letter had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late November of 1882, and Annie Hadley had read it and known something about it before she fully knew what she knew, and she had written back before the candle went out, and it had been the best decision she had ever made, and she had never once regretted the writing. She had answered 30 letters from men out west, and only one had not promised her anything, and it had turned out to be the one that kept all its word, because what it had offered her was true, and truth had been sufficient all along, and more than sufficient, and everything that the promises of the other 29 had tried and failed to be.